You know, our leaders loved the Second World War. Bush at one point thought he was Churchill. Blair many times thought he was Churchill. Remember that Saddam was the Hitler on the Tigris. And anyone who opposed the invasion of 2003, we were appeasers, like Neville Chamberlain, who appeased Hitler instead of going to war in 1938 instead of 1939. And similarly, in Egypt in 1956, when Britain finally showed its empire was worth nothing, we invaded Egypt because, according to Anthony Eden, who was our prime minister in 56, Nasser was the Mussolini on the Nile. They couldn't shake off World War II. We heard the other day Lieberman say, that Ahmadinejad, Lieberman and Ahmadinejad are equal versions of crackpots in my view. Lieberman said that Ahmadinejad was worse than Hitler. I mean, heavens above. That's not fantasy, that's beyond fantasy. That's the sequel to the movie we're currently constructing. I mean, just look at the... How is it that we allow all these think tanks, as I call the think tanks, all these sclerotic old men with their bloodless sandpits to tell us about war? Why is it you're never shown what we see? Eviscerated bodies, torn to pieces and eaten by dogs in the desert, after we, our Air Force, have dealt with them. Some of them soldiers, some of them civilians. You don't see it, and you won't see it. I remember, I've said this before, here in Sacramento, I saw the crew coming back from Basra with the footage of the results of British artillery bombardments, you know, dead children, one child holding on to his severed arm. And they wouldn't take it at the London end of the satellite feed because, first of all, they said they couldn't show it at tea time. Then they said it was pornography. And then they finished by saying, we can't show this footage because we have to respect human beings who've died. We see, we didn't respect them when we were killing them, but we respect them after they're dead. And of course, governments like this, because if war isn't lethal, if it isn't dirty, horrible, dangerous, and doesn't smell, you might be more keen to back our chaps and go to war and support various invasions, whether they be a sort of Blair fantasy, the Bush fantasy, or even, since he's now using more drone attacks in Pakistan than his predecessor, Obama fantasy. Look now briefly at our reporting of the Turkish ships, the flotilla as it was suddenly called. The flotilla is actually a naval force, not a civilian force. They were on its way to Gaza. Humanitarians, activist terrorists, there was the sort of balance that came out. They tried to take food and medicine by sea to the hungry Palestinians of Gaza. Now, we journalists at that time, when the boats were underway, should surely have been reminding our viewers and listeners of a long ago day when America and Britain went to the aid of a surrounded people, bringing food and fuel, and our own servicemen dying as they did so to help a starving population. That population had been surrounded by a fence erected by a brutal army which wished to starve the people into submission. The army was Russian. The city was Berlin. The wall was to come later. The people had been our enemies only 3 years earlier. Yet we flew the Berlin airlift to save them. Now look at Gaza today. Which Western journalist, since we love these historical parallels, even mentioned the 1948 Berlin airlift at the time of what Obama came to call the flotilla incident? It's an incident, not crisis, deaths, whatever. Instead, what did we get? Activists who turned into armed activists the moment they opposed the Israeli army's boarding parties. How dare these men upset the lexicon? Their punishment was obvious. They became terrorists. And the Israeli raids in which activists were killed, another proof of their terrorism, then became deadly raids, not unlike deadly massacres for the Armenians. In this case, of course, it was more excusable than it had been on Canadian television. 9 dead Turks do not equal 1.5 million Armenians. But it was interesting that the Israelis, who for their own reasons hitherto shamefully went along with Turkish denials of the Armenian genocide of 1915, suddenly they wanted people to talk about the 1915 massacres by the Turks of the Armenians, a subject which had been deleted from the narrative in Israel because there was only one Holocaust and it wasn't in 1915. Suddenly, it became a narrative you could describe again. All kinds of journalists who'd never known anything about the Armenian genocide suddenly started asking, what about the Armenian genocide? The Turks could hotly dispute it, so could the Globe and Mail, but Israel no longer did so. And what did the Israeli seaborne raid become? Well, it became a botched raid. Another word, botched. Botched is a lovely word. It began as a German origin Middle English word, bochen. I got this from the Oxford English Dictionary, not from Google, which I don't use, which meant to repair badly. And we were more or less kept that definition until our journalist lexicon advisors changed its meaning. School children botch an exam, remember. We could botch a piece of sewing, an attempt to repair a piece of material. We could even botch an attempt to persuade our boss to give us a raise. But now we botch a military operation. It wasn't a disaster, you see. It wasn't a catastrophe. It just killed some Turks. So given the bad publicity, the Israelis just botched the raid. Weirdly, the last time reporters and governments utilized the word botched followed Israel's attempt to kill the Hamas leader, Khaled Mashal, in the streets of Amman. In this case, Israel's professional assassins were caught after trying to poison Mashal, and King Hussein, you may remember, forced the Israeli Prime Minister, a certain B. Netanyahu, to provide the antidote and to let a lot of Hamas terrorists out of jail. Meshal's life was saved, but for Israel and its obedient Western journalists, this became a botched attempt on Meshal's life. Not because he wasn't meant to die, but because the Israelis failed to kill him. You can thus botch an operation by killing Turks, or you can botch an operation by not killing a Palestinian. This sort of journalism, which they got away with, and we all got away with, we just accepted, oh, it's a botched raid. Look at the situation in the Gaza war of 2008, 2009. I will not cover any war I cannot be in. I was in the Hezbollah-Israeli war in 2006. 2008, the Israelis let no Western journalists into Gaza. So I was, by chance, in Vancouver when the Gaza war started, but able to see, as I traveled across Canada to Europe, how journalists and newspapers bought the propaganda line. Let me give you an example and show you exactly what it was like. Come with Bob on his travels for a moment. And start off, well, let's start off in Toronto. Lorne Gunter writes in the National Post, founded by one Conrad Black, still in one of your penitentiaries, I believe, but soon to be released. Lorne Gunter begins his piece. This is the 29th of December, 2008. Remember, the war is going on. Assault is going into Gaza. And it's all because of those pesky missiles that keep raining down on Sderot. Or Najd. Anyone here knows where Najd is? Najd was the Arab name for Sderot before the Arabs were driven out in 48. In fact, you see some of the people firing these missiles, which is an act of terrorism if you go along with dictionary definition, yes, were the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of the people driven out of Najd, which is now Sderot, a point that wasn't made in most newspapers at the time. Anyway, here's Lorne Gunter. Suppose you lived in the Toronto suburb of Don Mills. A lot of Muslims live in Scarborough. And people from the suburb of Scarborough, about 10 kilometers away, were firing as many as 100 rockets a day into your yard, your kid's school, the strip mall down the street, and your dentist's office. Or perhaps you lived in Montreal's Outremont neighborhood, and your children had weekly emergency drills because people who hated you, absolutely blindly hated you, absolutely, were launching missiles by the score into your cul-de-sac and the nearby playground, and they've been doing it for 7 years, you see. Maybe you're in Vancouver. Militants were lobbing rockets every day across the Fraser River. Anyway, I went to Montreal, opened the paper, and what did I get? It would become 7,000 mortars now. And what did I get? I'm translating from French now. Imagine for a moment that the children of Longueuil in Montreal live day and night in horror and shock because shops, hospitals, schools are the target of terrorists located in Boissard, which is another, a lot of Afghans and Algerians live in Boissard. We got the point. Anyway, thank God, Air France, over the Atlantic, en route to France, I open my newspaper. What do I get from Robert Fulford? Is France prepared to hold its fire if Belgium starts lobbing explosives across its border? Would Russia tolerate? Anyway, I ended up in Dublin. Thank God, Dublin. Since at last you wouldn't get this sort of, somebody here, you see, pressed a button. This was a coordinated piece of propaganda. This wasn't by chance that all these papers, at the same time, all suddenly came out with, if you lived in X, Y, Z, right? But alas, I arrive in Dublin, open my Irish Times, the best Times on my side of the Atlantic, And I have a letter here I opened from Mr. Zion Evroni, Israeli ambassador to Dublin. The questions I've been asking the Irish people are fundamental to any discussion of Israel's action in Gaza. What would you do if Dublin was subjected to a bombardment of 8,000 rockets, it's gone up by 2,000, mortars similar to that endured by Israeli towns and cities for 8 years? Well, the funny thing is that when the British war in Northern Ireland was at its height, the Provisional IRA did launch mortars across the border into the United Kingdom. I know they did because Robert Fisk of the London Times was reporting from Belfast, heaven spare me, on the 23rd of February 1974. With extraordinary precision but remarkably little effect, the Provisional IRA mounted a heavy mortar and arms attack on British soldiers across the border from the Irish Republic. So what did we do? Did we send the RAF to bomb power stations in Dublin? Did we kill 1,300 Irish men, women and children in response to this terrorist assault by the IRA? No, we didn't. Because, of course, it would have been a war crime, wouldn't it? But we can't call it that for obvious reasons.